Hey, hello and welcome to this Science for a Sustainable Future webinar, which is a joint initiative of UN, SDSN and Springer Nature. This is in fact the fourth year in the series of events in which we bring together policymakers, government representatives, UN officials and leading global scientists to discuss and advance the objectives of Sustainable Development Goals. We are holding today's webinar in Zoom, which means that all of you participants are muted and your cameras are turned off. But please feel free to send your questions at any time using the Q&A function in the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. Our format today will be an initial discussion with the panelists, whom I will introduce to you in just a moment, after which we will turn to your questions from the audience. The seminar is being recorded, and the recording will be available shortly after the event. Just a couple of practical points. Should you drop out of the webinar at any point, please use the same login to rejoin us when you're ready. So I am the moderator for today's session, and I am Magdalena Skipper, Editor-in-Chief of Nature, a multidisciplinary science journal. Our focus today is on the intersection between energy provision, energy access, and social justice from the perspective of Indigenous communities and those in the Global South. And there are many dimensions to this intersection. One that is frequently overlooked is that billions of people, especially women, and especially in the Global South, rely on biomass and wood to cook. This has significant effects on indoor air quality, impacting people's health and lives more broadly. And this is especially pertinent to women and girls. Introducing cleaner energy solutions is imperative. We will be discussing solutions and practices. But we'll also discuss how can we channel research findings into policy actions that change these practices. Our session will look at the intersection between energy provision, energy access, and social justice, crucially, from the perspective of Indigenous communities, and as I say, those more broadly in the Global South. We will focus on a number of aspects, including household behaviours, technology development, costs, and policy support. So without further ado, let me start by introducing the wonderful panel I have with me to discuss this important topic. We have Dr. Abhishek Kar, who is a senior program lead at the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, one of Asia's leading not-for-profit policy research institutions. He is primarily responsible for interdisciplinary projects relating to clean cooking and household air pollution at the Council. Since 2007, Abhishek's multidisciplinary research experience and published work span air pollution, behavior changes in people, and policy analysis related to energy access in the Global South. Welcome, Abhishek. We also have with us Dr. Elisa Puzzolo, who is a Senior Research Fellow in Global Health at the University of Liverpool in the UK. She is also the co-lead of the Energy, Air Pollution and Global Health Group at the Department of Public Health Policy and Systems. And she is co-director of the group's flagship Clean Air Africa Global Health Research Unit. She has been working at the interface between academia, government institutions, civil society organizations, and private sector. Welcome, Elisa. And we also have with us Rosemary Idem, who is the program manager for women and youth at the forefront at Sustainable Energy for All, where she is responsible for leading efforts on removing current barriers to women and youth participation in the clean energy workforce. and in identifying, supporting, and championing the next generation of women and youth energy leaders to close the energy access gap, to ensure that no one is left behind. Rosemary is an energy expert with extensive experience in the off-grid energy sector, clean energy transition, and energy financing. Welcome, Rosemary. So let me start our conversation with a general question. What does social justice in the context of energy and sustainable future in the Global South mean to you? What are the key issues here from your perspective? And I'm going to start with you, Rosemary.
Thanks, Magdalena. First of all, I thank you for inviting me. I feel honored and privileged to be here to share my views. Starting with social justice, for me, it can be easily defined as equal rights and equitable opportunities for all. And this is also aligned to the goals of SDG 7, which advocates for clean, modern, affordable energy for everyone. Energy, as we all know, is cross-cutting and impacts every aspect of our lives, from education, healthcare, agriculture, and even clean cooking. And as we know, energy also impacts economic opportunities and economic development in regions. Looking at it from global trends right now, currently energy also accounts for 2/3 of GHG emissions. So to tackle the climate crisis, we have to address the decarbonization of energy systems, which means transitioning away from fossil fuels to clean energy solutions that emit less CO2. But this process has to be just and inclusive. And looking at it from the Global South context, SDG data shows us that over 700 million people don't have access to electricity, and over 2 billion don't have access to clean cooking. And 2/3 of that number are in the Global South, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. So to address these twin challenges of energy access and decarbonization, they have to be addressed at the same time. And also looking at the unique context of the regions, which adds on a third layer for the Global South, focusing on energy poverty, lifting people out of energy. This is linked to, for example, the fact that if you use Sub-Saharan Africa as an example, the communities, people, economies, GDP, revenue, in some areas is dependent on the extraction and production of fossil fuels. So when you say transitioning out of those sectors, it has a significant impact, and it's far-reaching consequences for the people in that region. So whatever solutions and processes that are going to be used to address their challenges has to adapt their unique context. It needs to take into consideration the complexities of the way of life of the people, because we can't afford to leave anyone behind. At SE4, one of the key things we've been doing is working with countries to determine clean energy pathways. This is using evidence-based processes and taking into context like the country's GDP, their revenue, macroeconomic factors, population, their energy demand and supply, to ensure that we help them develop a process or a pathway to clean energy transition that's sustainable, that lifts their people out of poverty, that creates jobs, and also simultaneously address their energy security issues and keeps their economies competitive. If we even talk about clean cooking and the impact of women, all of this has to come into context, and this has to be done with data and evidence, and also ensuring that there's buy-in from everyone. It has to be an inclusive process. Women have to be part of it. Community-based organization, NGOs, everyone's voice has to be heard because the impact and the consequences are far-reaching. Energy consumption in developing countries has been increasing over the past 15 years and is expected to grow. So energy demand across regions is set to consistently rise. So when you look at the need to address these issues, energy access, energy for industrialization, creation of jobs, achieving economic growth that actually leads to a lot of poverty requires energy transition planning and processes that are just and inclusive, which means that in simple terms, energy, climate development must be addressed holistically. So looking ahead in terms of recommendations and solutions, I would like to emphasize 3 points. One, energy transition planning, reiterating the point that it has to be inclusive, it has to be built upon policies and frameworks that tackles the issue of energy poverty, job creation, inclusiveness, meaning equal opportunities for people, and advancing economic development. Another key issue that is central to this discussion is financing. It can't be done without money. That's the truth. So increasing climate finance flows to these regions, taking opportunities like supporting the development of carbon markets, which is a unique opportunity to direct climate financing to these regions and help develop the economies there. And most importantly, inclusion, women and youth. I can't emphasize that point enough. Their voices have to be heard, their unique experiences, their views have to be taken into consideration. You can't more or less ignore half of the population. They bring a lot to the table. They have to be part of the end-to-end process from decision-making for developing solutions, and most importantly, implementing the solutions so they are not just at the byline. And this involves investing in creating opportunities for them, expanding opportunities, empowering them to leadership positions, and I mean, just taking their voices. They are unique people and they bring a lot to the table. So generally, to round up, for fairness and actual social justice, every person on the planet deserves and must have access to modern energy so that no one is actually left behind. Thank you. Back to you, Magdalena.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. You touched on so many key elements that I think we will be coming back to. Probably both Elisa and Abhishek will be commenting on them in the interventions now, but I'm hoping to ask you more questions, all of you actually, to build on that. But that was a really, really powerful statement. I'm going to turn to you, Elisa, now and ask you really the same question. What about the lens through which you look at the problem, at social justice in the context of energy access and energy transition?
Thank you, Magdalena. And obviously, I bring the public health perspective given the nature of my job, but just reflecting on how capturing the multifaceted nature of energy poverty in the global south and solution to address it, it's really a complex issue. As Rosemary was, the description the points she touched upon are very broad. But perhaps just a reflections from my perspective. If we think that having access to sufficient and secure, reliable amount of energy services is key to experience a decent quality of life for every one of us, the numbers are really important because we are talking here over 2.4 billion people still having lack of access to those resources to clean and reliable household energy. And the fuels they continue to use are, fuels like firewood, charcoal, coal in some regions, as well as kerosene for their everyday energy needs like cooking, heating, and lighting. And most of these people are poor. They live in informal urban settlements, and the majority also in rural areas of many low and middle income countries. If we think about the reliance on these fuels, some of the impacts are far-reaching and spans health, gender equality, as well as environment and climate. But particularly from the health perspective, we know that the use of polluting fuels burning traditional stoves and rudimentary stoves, some of those stoves available for most households, really create something called household pollution, which is now recognized as one of the greatest environmental risks to human health. The latest statistic for WHO, for example, estimate that 3.2 million people die prematurely each year on a global scale due to household pollution. And to put this into perspective, this is more than the annual death of malaria and HIV/AIDS combined. So the toll is very high. Therefore, there's a clear need for health-related policies affiliated with the clean cooking, clean household energy access agenda, as this issue is a key concern from all these different angles. And perhaps, thinking about your second questions on what are the key issues in tackling energy poverty in line with a sustainable future. My opinion is that a strong national enabling environment for creations of transition to clean household energy is needed. And what I mean by clean and enabling environment, it really includes a lot of different aspects. and that is government policy, fuel price policies that ultimately affects end user prices. Again, Rosemary was touching upon this, but also regulatory frameworks that should be tailored to both appliances, fuel distributions of fuel use to create safe access and use of these technologies, and as well as enforcement, because with lack of enforcement, there's no compliance, and therefore there are risks associated with the distributions and use of certain fuels and technologies. And so just to conclude, I'd like to say there's a lot of experience to be drawn upon on countries that some of them have successful transition. So we need to think through those examples. And if I can just cite some recent announcements from some of the governments now in Sub-Saharan Africa that are striving to tackle the issue also from the institutional perspective. If we think about schools and public hospitals, prisons, where there's still a lot of reliance on this traditional polluting fuels, this is not just a household level problem. It's really a societal problem with lots of institutions involved. You know, some governments now have announced bold actions to promote transition to clean household and institutional energy. By 2025, this is an example of Tanzania and Kenya. So I think looking at countries like them and see how they can be supported and how the countries can learn from those that are setting up those goals seems to be quite important from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Some really important points, and actually in general, I think indoor air pollution is underappreciated, whether it's considered in linkage with energy access, clean energy access and energy transition. We collectively tend to think about outdoor pollution as a more significant issue. And I think what's really powerful also your extension of the fact that indoor air pollution is not just the domestic setting, but it's also in a broader context and institutional. Wonderful to have these examples of countries in Africa that are already leading by example as you say, creating that strong enabling environment. And I'd like to come back to that in a minute. But first, I'd like to invite you, Abhishek, to give us your perspective on this broad perspective on social justice in the context of energy and sustainable future in the global south, of course, and what are the real issues there from your perspective. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Linda, for inviting me in this session. And I have always been kind of a very hands-on person and not really a theorist per se. So if you think of the 5 pillars of social justice on access, diversity, what it boils down operationally for me is in the global south, do people have access to affordable? Because you need access, and as pillar, equity cannot be addressed if it is not affordable. We need to take care of diversity, which means we need to make it safe and convenient, and energy service choices. So access to safe, convenient, and affordable energy service choices. Once people have it, we'll say that there has been energy justice has been delivered. So we need to really kind of try to operationalize whatever terms we are saying from the perspective of field, from the perspective of people, policymakers who are not theorists, from the perspective of implementation partners who may be very motivated but who are not really familiar with the theoretical framing of how we think of energy justice. And when we talk about policy action in this case, it's very important that we have localized context. There cannot be one size fit all for something called the global south. Global south is a catch-all term, but just imagine within the global south, we have South America, Latin America, where access to clean cooking as a primary cooking fuel is about 56%. And in the same global south, we have Sub-Saharan Africa, where the access to clean cooking is the clean cooking as a primary cooking fuel is just 10%. So even within the global south, we have diversity, and the decision making is often at the national scale. So when the donors, the funders, the bilaterals, the multilaterals, the international institutions are trying to promote clean cooking, they really need to understand that there is a lot of context specificity. Any action that we are proposing that we want towards energy justice that should be politically acceptable. And typically in a democratic framework, things are politically acceptable when it's socially acceptable. So we can't just randomly come up with a technology as, okay, this is good because in our lab, we have kind of done its brilliant performance. So here's it is. You like it or dislike it, this is your choice. No, we need to give people choices. And the second thing, which is like really important, is how do you really make it financially viable? Now, think of the tragedy here. The reliance on solid fuel, it cost about $2.4 trillion worth of global GDP, 2.5% of global GDP every year. And a World Bank study says that if there is an annual investment of $150 billion, we can fast scale try to solve the problem. In spite of the fact that $150 billion for a few years can help you save $2.4 trillion a year, there is not enough money on the table. And this is something which is very, very important as someone who is trying to get things moving on the ground. If there is no money, all the discussions, recommendations, they're not worth much unless they're actually implemented on the ground. And because I'll give an example of, the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana in India, which is a scheme to give free liquefied petroleum gas connection to poor women. And they have kind of done it for 95 million poor women in the last 5 years. Now, this is an example of an action on the ground. And has it been a perfect success? No, it has not been. But we need to signal as a society, as a scientific community, as a policy community, that we have to value and celebrate even 30% successes in field-based action projects than 10 very sophisticated frameworks, discussions, models that provide guidance on what should be done. Because in spite of all our great intellectual rigor, even if we have the best analytical minds, once we start putting things on the ground, we will come up with unanticipated issues, which will then bring us back to the drawing board. So let us really, if we want to deliver energy justice, talk about money. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was also a very powerful intervention. Your focus was very specific, but very well made. You precipitated some questions in the Q&A, which I will park for a moment, but we will come back to it. But from this round of your interventions, I'd like to follow up in 3 directions. So one thing that each one of you touched on, but I liked the way you just articulated it, Abhishek. You said in a democratic context, things are politically acceptable if they are socially acceptable. So my question to you, all of you, is how do we make things socially acceptable, things that perhaps go against tradition, cultural setting, cultural expectations, and what is the merit, or is there must be a merit, what's the merit of using tailor-made approaches to specific constituents in the population? And I guess I'm going to direct this question first to Rosemary, because you spoke so much about the importance of engaging women and youth. And so in your work, how do you, what can you give us maybe an example of a successful intervention that becomes socially acceptable amongst women, amongst youth? How do you make something socially acceptable so that it becomes politically acceptable?
Sorry, thanks, Magdalena. I mean, the way I would like to look at it is when you think of social things being socially acceptable, think of addressing the issues that are unique to people. If someone doesn't have a job, someone is going to a hospital, so someone, people, I mean, to put it this way, energy is more or less, it's life and death for some people. So addressing those unique challenges makes a difference. It makes people would accept issues, solutions that are put in front of them. For example, in my past work, we've worked in areas where people have never ever had electricity before. It was mind-boggling to me, and I lived in Africa to realize that there are actually places where someone has not seen a light bulb go on. So when, of course, when you change, behavioral change is complicated. If you look at it from even the context of clean cooking, Sub-Saharan Africa, where I know I lived in 4 years, and I know is, you have to look at it from the context of the people. People cook communally. They have homes and families where a meal means cooking for 10, 15 people. So when you're tailoring solutions for people like that, you have to be conscious to those issues. So if you're providing energy to people, they have to experience, and they have this engagement has to happen to let them understand the benefits of these solutions. We've done energy projects where, first of all, there was resistance for switching from petrol and diesel generators to clean energy. Why? Because this is something they know, something they're used to. But one of the solutions we even had was asking them, okay, well, give them this energy for a short period of time, let them try it out. And people tried it out, and slowly they came to understand that this change is better. Noise pollution went down, and in 6 months, they experienced the savings. Someone went from having 3 employees to employing 8 to 10 people. That's an impact. You have created jobs, you have made young people employed, and these are even women. So when you're tailoring solutions to people, that engagement part is really, really critical, because people have to understand, and you have to look at it and take into consideration the unique context of their environment, their social norms, their religion, their culture. You can't ignore that. You can't just hand things to people. You have to work with them to understand the processes. And when they do, and they can see the impact on their lives, it changes things. So for me, that's the sweet spot.
Exactly. So it's a very good point, and you talked about it in your original intervention about the importance of getting a buy-in from everyone in the society, and now you're emphasizing the importance of co-creation and real involvement in the whole process. Absolutely. Another thing I wanted to touch on is this idea of the national level. And again, this is something that, Elisa, you talked about. You talked about 2 examples of these. You described them as strong national enabling environments. Can you tell us a little bit more about that example of, either Kenya or Tanzania that you talked about? Abhishek also mentioned about the fact that decisions are made at a national level in many cases. So that's why it's so important. And that your answer will also lead us into the next point that I wanted to touch on.
Thanks. Thank you, Magdalena. So definitely, I think if there is not the right policy support, there will be no opportunities for people to have access to those accessible, reliable technologies and fuels, what Abhishek was mentioning. So creating that initial step with that policy commitment, in my perspective, is very important, is the beginning, because having access does not necessarily mean sustained use of the technology, and the Indian experience, speaks to that. But perhaps I want to emphasize a couple of things. Firstly, what the Indians have done, or what the people in Indonesia, the government of Indonesia have done, has been massive. To be able to give access to millions of people, we're talking of very, very large numbers in just a few years, it's something unique. Not many countries have managed, those enabling transitions. So has it been possible? It has been possible because there was a very strong government leadership. And there was the industry, there were supply chains that were put in place very quickly so that people can get access to cleaner fuel technologies. In particular, we're talking here of liquefied petroleum gas, which is one of the most scalable solutions for the global south. And if we think, Abhishek again was bringing the examples of the difference of access in different countries. Well, the reality is that a lot of us in the north, in the Western societies, has gone through that process of using gas and now more recently moving on to electricity. And the gas has been a solution that people have adjusted over time. Many of us now are able to cook, switch the stove and cook quickly, open the flame and switch off your flame. So I think there are barriers in terms of, getting used to traditions and way people cook, etc., and, cooking communally, cooking for large gatherings. But somehow people have managed to adjust. And in some of these countries, and Latin America leads examples, where a lot of the population in Latin America have moved already into gas, and some of them moving into electricity. So that's why I always keep saying we need to go back and look at examples, how this country have made a success. And without those national enabling policies, they would have never have success. So I think sometimes we have the fear that people will not be able to switch. Therefore, we need to tackle solutions that people can embrace, but we don't have to invent a lot of solutions. Some solutions are there. It's more how the solution are made available and especially affordable to people. And perhaps my final comment on this is also that not everybody accesses fuels for free. A lot of people really are paying for the fuels for part of the household energy expenditure, both for cooking and for electricity. So it is the wrong framework to keep saying, oh, people will never be able to afford, because in reality, they are spending already money for polluting fuels. And I mentioned here charcoal, and I mentioned here kerosene, where a lot of people are relying upon, and it's very detrimental to health. So all of these people that are already paying for fuels, they might be the first to be able to transition to clean household energy. And with that, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very, very important point. And in your various contributions, I should say, Abhishek, we're going to come to money in a minute. There are lots of questions about money, which clearly is on everyone's mind. But before we get there, let me focus on two things which are emerging in our conversation already. That there are important bridges or important linkage between research that supplies us with data and analysis and potential interventions that are then translated into policies, and then the bridge from policy to actual implementation, which is, a number of you have touched on already. And each one of you touched on these different elements. So let me explore this, and I'm just going to throw it open to any one of you who would like to pick it up. Let's take the first bridge, that transition between research and policy. There often is a frustration in terms of the language not being the same language of researchers and policymakers. Is there a common understanding on what type of data are available or gathered that would be useful for policymakers? Again, other good examples that already exist that we can learn from, and some glaring omissions, some maybe calls to action that we can come up with during this conversation. Anyone would like to take this?
I can.
Go ahead.
So I'm at this point of time, I'm writing a book with a policymaker who actually ran the PMUA program of giving 95 million. And the reason why we're writing this book together is because there has been so much frustration in our conversations, things that I think are obvious. He says it's not doable. And things which he says, I'm like, this is not optimal. There is a huge, huge gap between how researchers perceive a problem and how policymakers perceive a problem. Let me give you one very simple example. For a policymaker, whatever policy you want to roll out, that should be implementable given the general administrative and technical capacity. So of course, you will have some bright, brilliant, innovative, excellent officers in some pockets who will be able to roll out even difficult things. But vast majority, if you think of the bell curve, like vast majority of people are in the middle, the officials, and they have 200 other jobs. So within that, given the time constraints, given the technological constraints, what it is that is doable. And that often is not something that researchers have an excellent insight into, because they are in a different silo and the policymakers are in a different silo. For example, in the PMUI program, they could really scale it up very fast is because they had a strong IT infrastructure. Today, even a mid-level manager at one of the India's LPG companies, liquid petroleum gas selling companies, can sit and find out that yesterday in a given shop, how many cylinders were sold. Was it a 14.2 kg cylinder? Was it a 5 kg cylinder? How many customers came? The customers who came, in what frequency they're coming. This same level of information, even if the country's leadership wants, in many sub-Saharan African countries, they will not be able to get because the system is not in place. So it is very, very important when we talk about the connect between research and policy, that this disconnect often comes because we are not really cognizant as researchers of the constraints that policymakers. So policymakers are often like, so one policymaker once joked that it's not like I am the emperor of India that whatever I see is going to be done. We have to work with given the systems, given the capacity, given the finance, and given that technical capacity. So given all of those kind of put in constraints in place, which often we do not have insight.
Thank you. And I really liked your example of the availability of the data, real life data that can then be enacted on. So Rosemary, you spoke about availability of data and evidence to support implementation. I think that's really really crucial. And then the question becomes, are the right data available in the right contexts across countries or regions? And Elisa, I want to ask you, because I know that your background is in evaluation of interventions. So from that perspective, how do you find in general that there is much data that is missing? Is there, for example, diversity of data, which makes it difficult to compare different interventions? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, thank you for that question. So from the public health perspective, we know that the majority of interventions and other pollutants that are health detrimental are particularly two of them. One is fine particulate matter and carbon monoxide. They go deep down into the lungs. And there's a wide range of disease and conditions that are related to exposure to hazardous pollution. And the reality is that has been over 40 years of research now looking at the impacts of different interventions. And there are systematic reviews and meta-analysis. This is a term to include, extensive reviews of different epidemiological studies done at the country level, for example, that are there in the public domain, perhaps, in a more technical language and not directly accessible to some policymakers. But the reality is that the evidence is quite clear. And WHO has set up guidelines, national, so it's a global indoor air quality guidelines that governments can rely upon. And the evidence is quite strong and clear on what technologies work and what technologies don't work from a health perspective and associated climate co-benefits. So I would say that from that point of view, the evidence is there. Is how implementers use that evidence. And someone was mentioning there's still that desire to promote a new fancy stove, new technology that burns biomass. But so far, the reality is none of these biomass technologies used over time under normal day-to-day conditions really achieves those health benefits, don't meet those guidance levels. This is because just user operations, the way that the fuel is dry or wet, have an impact. Where other technologies, they can't be compromised. They just perform always in the best possible way. So I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel in terms of that type of evidence. It's more to bridge that gap that the evidence it's brought to the attentions of policymakers. And there is that connection between all of the different actors, because sometimes decisions are made at the Ministry of Energy level. And in reality, some of this agenda falls under other ministries. But the funding are not there.
Yes, that's interesting. The key question, how do we bring the evidence to the attention of policymakers? And you just touched on another issue which pops up in many different contexts, and that is how ministries can be siloed and not share information, speak to one another. And then, of course, the next question is, which was the second part of my question, is how do we take the policies and implement them? Does this question take us into the realm of money or other aspects to this? Because we're going to discuss money, I think, probably for the rest of the webinar. There are lots of questions here about the affordability of the solutions. But do you think there's another aspect that needs to be looked at in that, as I called it, the second bridge between the policies being in place and the actual practical implementation of these policies, apart from the financial aspect? Or is finance the key? Somebody mentioned infrastructure as well. I guess it depends what policies are being implemented. Let's move on to the money, because that is really has emerged as a very strong theme, and I think rightly so. I'm going to bring in Rosemary first, and then I'm going to turn to Abhishek, because Rosemary, you were the first to speak about the money, and rightly so, about the fact that there needs to be financing and financial support, because the just energy transition has to happen in the context of economic development. That was one of your key messages, right? Again, absolutely rightly so. And you mentioned this developing carbon markets as a way of bringing finances into the region. Can you speak a little bit more? Is there an example that you can share with us where it has worked?
Yes. I mean, looking at the current crisis globally, from COVID to the war in Ukraine, we all know that finance flows to even renewable energy projects and even the global south has diminished. And we know that the urgency hasn't. So things have to happen now. And many countries are looking at how best to meet their net zero targets, and which are quite ambitious, and the world wants them to do that because we all want to save the planet. But this involves money. I raised the issue of carbon markets because right now, even in the context of justice, there's a wide disparity between the cost of carbon credits from areas in the global south and areas in the global north. The cost is wide. And we see this as a unique opportunity because in the global south, there are different projects, there are opportunities for the continent, we use sub-Saharan Africa, to benefit and leverage this opportunity. And this has to be done looking at their context. For example, if you use Nigeria, over like 50 gigawatts of their energy comes from diesel and petrol. So if you look at it from a climate perspective, displacing that is actually helping the planet, but there are no clear frameworks to capture those kind of credits, which could actually divert funding for a country like that to meet its net zero targets. So a good example is that at the SE for All, GIAP and some of our partners recently at COP launched something called the African Carbon Market Initiative, which aims to address these disparities, these challenges, and also ensure that Africa is able to develop high integrity credit and be able to leverage these opportunities, because funding needs to happen. Funding needs to be diverted to fund renewable energy projects. And even the communities have a huge chance to benefit. I mean, for example, if you look at even the Congo Basin, these areas have been protected by the local communities for years, but they are not really reaping the benefit because they are not clear biodiversity divided by the biodiversity credits. For instance, if somebody cuts down the trees or part of the wall and grows a plant a new tree, they get credits. But people who have been protecting these areas for years and protecting the flora and bio issues there don't get any funding. So this is a clear opportunity where governments, the global world stakeholders should consider supporting Africa and other areas in the global south to be able to develop high integrity credit to be able to access carbon financing.
Thank you. Excellent examples, and really illustrating a mixture of how diversity and equity have to come together, right? Rather than taking some things for granted in one location, one global location, whereas effectively elevating them and rewarding them in another. You touched on many really important points there. Abhishek, I'm going to put you on the spot and roll a couple of questions from the audience into one. There are many questions about affordability. And you very strongly in your original intervention made the point that theory is not enough. We need the money to implement them. So a number of points here. One, specifically in sub-Saharan, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, being, of course, encouraged to transition to clean energy. And the question is, how can funding be channeled and access to support the indigenous people become participants in energy access and social justice, who are there to change practices? And this is because setting up briquette production is quite expensive. Then there is another linked question saying, how can people in the global south cook at home without firewood? Can they even afford any other type of energy? And there are a couple of other questions in this vein. They're difficult questions on the ground. There's actually another question which I wanted to roll into this, and that is, right, so part of the question is, should the governments intervene and set a ceiling to the selling price of energy products so that the profit margins of multinational energy companies be brought back to reasonable, sustainable levels for the private sector, right? So many different strands here. I'm just going to throw them at you.
Right. So I think the problem of clean cooking is in some ways a symptom of a disease, and the disease is much more deep structural problem, which is around poverty, around patriarchy. So investment in sub-Saharan Africa, or even a country like India, it comes in, especially foreign investment, which we desperately need. If we need $150 billion to be put into this space, it will come once the companies view the people as consumers. Once they know, okay, there is a market, and if I can maybe invest for 2-3 years and get people used to the clean cooking fuels, then my business is going to grow. So the return on investment, while we may say it should come, the wood is going to happen only when we see people, the society as a whole, become richer, and they get more money. Because you don't have to really go and tell, please come. If they see that there is a business opportunity and people can buy it. So there are two parts of the entire affordability question. One is the willingness to buy, and I'll come to this, and one is the ability to buy. So if there is an ability to buy, the businesses are going to jump in without any support. However, initially there is need for a heavy public investment, which is does not care about ROI, which just wants to do it for social good. Because ultimately the taxpayers are giving money for the development of the country, and if a huge chunk of the population is really disadvantaged, it is kind of a duty of the national governments and also the multilaterals, if they truly care about what they talk about energy justice and others, then there needs to be some amount of investment put in for infrastructure. Say, for example, a company which is selling LPG is not going to come to a region with poor roads, because then the cost of transportation of LPG is going to be much more higher, and that is going to make the business financially non-viable. The second part of it is on the willingness to pay. So even if someone is willing to pay from a household perspective, do they see it as a value for money? And I think this is such an important thing, which is often kind of not thought through when we discuss this affordability part of it. Value for money is when like people are not like, let's be kind of, let's not try to think of, oh my God, those are the poor people. You have to go and explain to them, and then they will realize and understand how good it is for them, and they're going to adopt. People are smart people. They are struggling in poverty, and I believe they require much more street smartness and kept to even survive under those conditions, under such extreme resource scarce conditions? Are they seeing value in the technology that we're providing? If they see a value in it, they are going to adopt it as long as you make it accessible, safe, convenient, and affordable for them. So the money part, I think initially the national government bilaterals need to put in some money to make the system ready, to set up the digital infrastructure, to set up the roads, to make it easy for the businesses to come in. But business is going to come in only when sadly they see people as consumers, and that's why it's important to go for economic prosperity. Otherwise, piecemeal donations, donor projects, charity foundations, they simply cannot lift 2.4 billion people out of the cooking energy poverty that we're seeing.
That's a really important point, because of course we're talking about an ecosystem here. And so you talked about value for money. When you framed this argument, you were framing it at least at some point at the level of individuals, but then towards the end you lifted it out to a sort of, let's say, national. Truly, it's international or more than national, but certainly at a national level. And thinking about some of the issues that you touched on, Elisa, in the context of health implications of effectively dirty fuel, cooking with dirty fuel, and household air pollution. Rosemary, you touched on the issue of job availability and future prospects for the youth. The value for money for a government should be looked at in a total sense, in a system sense, not just in the context of energy, but also in the context of health, in the context of the whole economy. So my question to you, and maybe Elisa, you can respond to it at least from a public health perspective: is such a more holistic view practiced at a national level anywhere?
That's an interesting question. So I think the anywhere is important. It depends on the countries. But this holistic view and these contributions for the governments have made possible change in some countries. So allow me to give some examples. In Kenya, at some point, VAT was imposed on fuels, for example, on LPG. And therefore, a lot of people that had managed to transition to afford LPG during the pandemic and after the pandemic were unable to do so because of the reimpositions of VAT. And then VAT, just a few months ago, was reduced and then removed again. So that's, I think, going back to what Abhishek was also saying, the interventions from the government point of view in terms of taxation is very important, because it's at the governmental level that policy could be tailored to the poorest of the poor, where we know these people will never be able to afford clean fuels and solutions. One of the questions was asking if people are below the $1 per day. But that's where really strong policy is needed. And then in one of your other remarks, you were saying, or perhaps was one of the questions, whether we should impose a cap. Yes, I personally believe that the government, and again, each country needs to do their own calculations and take on their own decisions, should create what I was calling those enabling conditions to really look at what protective measure could be put in place from a financial point of view to protect the consumers. Because the industry, and this is all type of industry, the larger the industry, the more, they can quickly build up this promotion, the supply chains, only if also there's guarantee that there are those enabling conditions in place for them to have returns. So the holistic approach you're mentioning, the examples I've made, I think are quite important. Perhaps I want to just finish again on the experience of Kenya. It's one of the countries I've been working more closely as part of my role as co-director for the Cleaner Africa Global Health Research Unit, funded by the NIHR, the National Institute of Health and Care Research in the UK. Because something really powerful is happening in Kenya now with the new government, the announcement by the president. We just recently signed a tripartite agreement with the First Lady's Office of Kenya to work together as part of Liverpool University, the Kenya Medical Research Institute, and the Office of the First Lady to really work on health promotion and training of community health workers to help and raise the awareness of lack of access to clean household energy. And that means training 130,000 community health workforces and therefore being able to reach all of the Kenyan population. So we're talking here of 50 million people. And for those people who will not be able to afford a truly clean solutions, there are other ways they can still protect themselves from the exposure to polluting fuels, like ventilations, cooking outdoor, and trying to access at least a better technology than what they're currently using, like open fires. So I think there is really that opportunity to work closely with the different ministry in trying to create that integrated approach. And bringing in the health community workforces is one of the ways that will allow us to really tackle this from a bottom of the pyramid, really reaching millions of households and helping them to realize that there is an issue, because some people don't even know that that's a problem for the environment, that's a problem for their health. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a terrific example. I'd like to weave in another question from the audience. And that's a question about the role of NGOs. So in our discussion, we talked about researchers, policymakers, and implementation on the ground. The question is, what does the panel think? Where does NGOs, when do they fit in this struggle? The question asked, but I think maybe it's this sort of complex network of interactions. Anyone feels there's a particular unique role for NGOs? Rosemary, do you want to make a comment?
I think it depends on the sector. NGOs have a critical role to play, especially in voicing the views of local communities who don't have that platform. So I strongly believe they should be involved in also feeding into the decision-making process, the policies that are being made, because in terms of energy transition, it's both a top-down and bottom-up process, and to ensure that everyone is aligned and there's buy-in as a country, because at the end of the day, it's not just the government's responsibility. Everyone has a role to play. So they play a significant role in ensuring that the voices of the marginalized groups and people who don't have that platform and access are heard, and they also play a role in also sensitizing communities and people and ensuring that targeted solutions reach the right people.
Thank you. Let me ask one final question from the audience. There are many more. We won't have time to address them all. Apologies in advance. But Abhishek, maybe I'll ask you to take this one. And that's, do you have insights into what poor people lose out in this energy transition? Is there potential to see the role of the loss and damage fund here, for example?
See, since the time we began this seminar, it has been 1 hour. And in this 1 hour, it is estimated that about 350 plus people have had premature deaths, which attribute to household pollution. So there is an urgency in the space. And because the poor do not have a voice, they lose out on this urgency. If it had been any other place where in 1 hour, 350 people are losing lives for no fault of theirs, it would have been a national and international scandal. It doesn't happen here because people take it for granted. So poverty, in some ways, really diminishes people's voice and people's choice. So in this entire transactions of energy transaction, various stakeholders, the civil society, I'll touch upon your previous point, the civil society in many ways are the voice of the oppressed people. So if there is truly a intention to make changes on the ground, greater role must be played, and these NGOs, grassroots NGOs, must get a seat on the table to tell them what is really required and give them insights from the ground, which is sorely lacking in some of the really high-level analytical discussions here.
Thank you very much. So we will have to end here on this powerful and chilling note, actually, about the importance of bringing everyone to the table and giving them opportunity to share their perspective. And this, in fact, has been a major theme, one of the major themes in our conversation, that everything we discussed happens within an ecosystem which is not just focused on energy or not just focused on health. If we are going to solve the problem, the totality, the sort of holistic approach is really required. And by extension of that, everybody needs to be involved. The whole society across the globe, with all the constituents of society, representing their needs and their constraints, need to be at the table. And of course, we talked about this actually quite a complex web of interactions between researchers who generate the data and propose interventions, policymakers, and then the implementation of these policies. And we, of course, also talked about the very real need for finance, and finance which is equitable and available to sustain economic growth in the global south. Also importantly, we talked about the fact that one size does not fit all, that successful examples need to be taken as examples, but then implemented and dissected in a local context. So I want to thank very much my panelists, Elisa, Rosemary, and Abhishek. This was a really interesting conversation. Thank you very much to all of you who've joined us for this webinar and asked fantastic questions. Thank you. And I think my colleagues have added information here about the recording and also about the final webinar, which will happen in the series, which will happen on Wednesday, the 26th of April. And that will focus on energy and science communication. Thank you very much again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.